Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, signori. Good evening and welcome to the British School of Rome. My name is Stephen Kay. I'm the archaeology manager here at the school. It is my pleasure this evening to introduce Professor Ian Haynes, who is the principal investigator of the project Rome Transformed, which is the interdisciplinary analysis of political, military and religious regenerations of the city's forgotten quarter from the 1st to the 8th century AD. It's, as you had heard, and for those of you online, welcome to the British School at Rome. It's our pleasure to welcome you here tonight. This afternoon we've heard a first few presentations from this project, which has been running since 2019, funded by the European Research Council, and will conclude this year in October. So tonight is this lecture is given by Ian Haynes on behalf of all of the team who have been working on this project. It's a very multidisciplinary, multi-institutional in many ways project, and was relied upon the good offices of many colleagues here in Rome and elsewhere. So it's Ian speaking on behalf of a very large group of people, but it's our pleasure to welcome him to give this talk tonight. And I encourage you, those both here in Rome and those of you online, to continue to hear more about the project over the next 2 days. The link is on our website, the British School of Rome, and you can sign on and register through Zoom to follow the proceedings over the next 2 days of the results of this outstanding project. For those of you online, there is the question and answer function on Zoom, and at the end of the lecture, you're very welcome to type in questions, and I will relay them to the speaker. And also for those of you here as well, again, you're obviously very welcome to ask questions at the end. So without any further ado, it's my pleasure to invite Professor Ian Haynes, also Chair of Archaeology here at the British School at Rome, to give this evening's lecture on the transformation of the Eastern Caelian from the 1st to the 8th century CE. Ian, over to you.
Steve, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here this evening. Thank you, those of you who are joining us online. And as Steve said, it is my privilege to speak on behalf of a very large number of people, a very expert number of people. And when we get to the questions and discussion, I won't hesitate to bring those many voices into play, because in many cases, of course, they know a great deal more about what I'm talking about than I do. But what I'd like to do in broad terms today is to try and accomplish both an introduction to the exciting programme that is following after already a very stimulating afternoon discussing the methodology of Rome Transformed, and also to give a little bit of a sense of our direction of travel. We are in our final year here of a 5-year programme, and there is still work to be done. So a key part of Rome Transformed's philosophy is to actively provoke and invite responses which we are most grateful for and seek to feed into our work as we progress. So, Rome. Rome, of course, is a powerful idea. And so when we are talking about the physical transformation of the city, we're also talking about the intersection of that evolving physical transformation with an array of ideas that continue to inspire and provoke people across the ancient world and through to today. That Rome was a point of cultural reference again and again, of course, is no surprise to any of us here. We can think of examples, I'm sure, as diverse as Virgil's references in the twilight of the Republic to Rome as a towering cypress tree, to the ground-hugging ossia of the smaller towns or other towns that might be inspired by it. We can think of Ausonius referring in his Ordo Urbium Nobelium to Al as a little Gallic Rome. And we can think still later again, just after Charlemagne's coronation in Rome, of the comments of the anonymous author of the so-called Calcipos, who refers to one of Charlemagne's own foundations, whether he's talking about Aachen or Paderborn, we might debate separately, but as another flourishing Rome. So Rome then is a source of inspiration, and the transformation and the growth of Rome can be situated, of course, as a discussion point, as it frequently has been, both in terms of study of the phenomenon of urbanism and of the distinctiveness of the particularities of Rome. One of the areas where there's been a lot of interesting work, of course, recently in terms of thinking about Rome in wider debates on urbanism is in the concept of the fringe belt, a concept that really was brought out in Human Geography by Conzen back in 1960. It's an area that's been worked upon by my good friend and mentor, Paolo Lavorani, in many powerful works on the topography of Rome, and also very usefully in theoretical reflection by Matthew Mandich as he's looked at the transformation of suburbium and how we should theorize that in its journey from republic to empire. But what a lot of these studies do is, well, they note this fringe belt phenomenon, and this, let me define it via Conzen here, a belt-like zone originating from the temporarily stationary or very slowly advancing fringe of a town and composed of a characteristic mixture of land use units, initially seeking a peripheral location. Well, that applies as a useful concept to thinking about areas such as the one we're going to be talking about today. It is also, of course, notable that there are particularities in Rome itself. One thinks of the Horti and their very special character and relationship to power, politics, and culture in Rome's society. Now, our area, I would suggest, is a particularly interesting one to explore these changes because of its position, largely outside the ancient Pomerium. It is nonetheless a space that is incorporated within the Aurelian Wall circuit from the 270s. It is on the fringes of the ancient city, but with the establishment in the early 4th century by Constantine of the world's first cathedral, it ends up becoming the seat of the Bishop of Rome and the Pope, and a place of considerable significance and centrality for Catholic Christendom for a millennium thereafter. To try and manage archaeologically and through interdisciplinary approaches this large area, we've broken it down into 9 separate spaces, and all of these have very different characteristics. But I would flag that some of our spaces or units of study include a substantial stretch, some 1.5 kilometres of the Aurelian walls, that's marked as 9 in the simplified sketch, and also a section 0.67 kilometres long of the Claudio-Neronian aqueduct. So different structures, different spaces, some above ground, some below ground, all requiring an integrated form of study which allows us to actually take forward what we mean by transformation. Now, there have been various discussions and uses of the word transformation, particularly in Anglophone literature, which have sometimes found the term unsuitable to really accommodating the drama of some of the changes in society that take place during the period with which we're concerned. But it's important to note that we are using the term transformation in this project in a relatively straightforward manner. That is to say that we are talking about the physicality of change in 4 dimensions. Clearly, an urban space can be transformed through radical changes to its natural environment. Property spaces can undergo radical changes in ownership, which will have all sorts of implications for their use, their function. Roman law, of course, as Paul tells us in the Digest, also has ways of declaring or consecrating land which transform what can and cannot be done to them quite dramatically. We can imagine situations, we must envisage, we must engage with situations where there is economic change and demographic change. But what we're looking at primarily here are the changing shapes of built spaces, open spaces, and the natural environment. And of course, that issue of transformation continues to the present day. And this slide, which I very much like, which was grabbed from Google Earth not so very long ago, reminds us, of course, that our area continues to change, because in this image, you can see what is now a rather splendid park is still bearing the scars of the engineering associated with those important Metro C works, which are a great source of generously shared information and inspiration for those of us working on Rome Transformed. Now, for those who are not familiar with the area, let me just point out some key points of reference here. This is the Lateran Basilica complex, and at the far end we have Santa Croce, and this is the line of the Aurelian Wall. And the Rome Transformed research area encompasses this. The area of the Ospedale reaches up through here, incorporating the Villa Volkonski, where the British ambassador has their residence, and Santa Croce there at the end. Those who have followed Rome Transformed before will be familiar with some of what I'm going to say relatively rapidly now. And it's echoing some of the points that we were making earlier on. This is the range of methodology and effort that my colleagues have invested in order to provide us with the data that we are using. Now, one of the points that I would stress here is much of what I'm going to be saying today is about looking at landscape models as a way of talking about transformation, that 4D transformation. But to be able to say that in, I hope, a useful way, and more importantly still in some ways, to provide a resource of data, hard data, that future colleagues can contest and develop and explore. Well, that's involved a lot of time on the ground. It's involved extensive work in structural analysis, above ground, below ground, at over 36 separate archaeological sites within the area, up to 25 metres above the modern ground surface and down to 8 metres or so below. It's involved a process of laser scanning and structure from motion. Laser scanning alone over, as Alex Turner was telling us earlier on, over 199 billion points of data captured in terms of making sure that we are looking at data that is not just, as I would say, beautiful and valuable for analysis, but is geospatially correct. That has involved various forms of collaboration, including a welcome collaboration with our colleagues from the University of Siena when the buildings got too high for us to apply terrestrial laser scanning, and UAV-based photogrammetry was used. Bringing those models together, as my colleague Alex Turner again was speaking about today, is its own kind of challenge. It's involved an extensive array of geophysical survey, which is taken in well over 9 hectares, through a range of different systems, a range of different antennae, as Steve kindly told us again this afternoon, and of course electrical resistance tomography, allowing detailed work at greater depths. That has been complemented by a program of borehole survey, 2 surveys specially commissioned by Rome Transformed to complement the data, legacy data and information generously donated from Metro C, to give us a picture of the conditions subsurface that can be effectively integrated with different sources of data. So an image, I think Steve showed a version of this image earlier on too, developing on a method pioneered by colleagues at Portus, which integrates geophysics sections with the data from borehole surveys, integrating this again with an array of historical cartography, site documentation, We owe a great deal, of course, to our friends at Archeocitar and elsewhere for access to that, and to the work of our colleague Francesca Carboni in sourcing that material. Historical photography, and much more besides. So we're drawing on an extremely rich legacy. We're drawing, of course, on a rich intellectual legacy. The list of eminent scholars to have engaged with this area is long indeed, but we come back again and again to the work of Collini and Lanciani. We come back to some of the great figures of architectural history. Krautheimer makes an appearance many, many times. And we are seeking to weave together these perspectives with fresh field work, with the highest standards of geospatial accuracy, good quality geomatics data, to actually produce a legacy data set that we can use in refreshing ways, and we hope others can too. So our approach involves several stages. Analysis and synthesis involves integrating these different forms of data, and we use 3D models a lot to help us think about how these geospatial, these four-dimensional relationships work together. And our approach is explicitly one of provocation. That is to say that we seek to present images and models that allow various perspectives to be made explicit in an interdisciplinary way and contested. And we benefited greatly from colleagues, a huge number of them in the audience, online and in person, who've given us feedback, not always the feedback that we most wanted to hear, but feedback that we desperately needed, that improved and took forward arguments and understandings. And we've sat that, and we've sat a lot of that data already in a system that you can find online. For those of you who haven't encountered this before, it's our system called RT-SheDoc, which offers a very summary and easy access form of looking at how we have justified our arguments for certain visualizations. We call them provocations. And as we see those as the building blocks of these larger landscape arguments. These are not seen, I must emphasize, as an alternative to technical interim reports, the full research reports. Those are coming too, but they are part of our shared thinking process. And as we build these things together, as Margherita Razzari kindly outlined this afternoon in a welcome presentation on the RT 3D system, we are trying to build these different elements into a wider understanding of the landscape. And in doing that, the data that's being recorded through all of these different systems, whether we're talking about borehole or structural analysis of buildings, allows us to get a sense of varying ancient ground heights. We're trying to keep that sense of the shifting ground surface of Rome, against which all of these other buildings must be seen, all these other developments must be seen firmly in focus. When I say that, it is worth remembering that there are times in antiquity, in the period in which we're discussing, when the ground height can rise by about 5 meters in a century. So these are non-trivial considerations. If we really want to move forward in our understanding of topography, we have to value, of course, the data we receive in 2 dimensions, but seek to work harder to visualize it and understand it in 3 and 4. Now, talking of information that we've received in 2 dimensions, it is always worth remembering just how much rich legacy data can be brought into a synthesis like this. In her presentation earlier on today, Elettra Santucci, who's our lead on hydraulics, was talking about the landscape of Rome transformed. And it is important to think back to the data. This is something being further developed and refined through the Florence team at with RT3D, about the implications of not only the natural topography, but of course watercourses especially, in terms of shaping our area. And Elettra flagged up very usefully the Marana, which is a more complicated space, and of course a more dynamic watercourse than that little caption would suggest, but also the Fosso di Santa Croce, which is a very significant body of water, I would argue, for understanding what is happening topographically later and through time. Now, Elettra also showed us this picture, which I think is a fantastic testimony to the work, again, of the Metro C team. Unfortunately for us, it doesn't cover our entire area. It rather lies to the south and shows a little bit of the western edge of our area. The Aurelian Wall has been thrown into that picture to give you an orientation to what is, in fact, a visualization of a pre-anthropogenic landscape. But nonetheless, a number of the salient elements there are very important for us to think with. And if I can once more harvest some of the brilliant insights of Dimitrescu and his extraordinary visualization work, I would note again, as did Elettra, of just how important that watery theme is on the southern edge and indeed still further into our area, as we see the careful management of water sources and how that helps to shape the landscape of the Horti. Keep an eye, by the way, on this bridge. Although I can't guarantee that the people on it will stay in the same place, the bridge will appear from time to time as we go forward. Now, that issue of water and watercourses as something that has agency in terms of our understanding of the physical transformation, something we want to refine our understanding of, comes through, I would argue, particularly strongly here. We are looking at a stretch of the Aurelian Wall, of course, here. And what we can say from close analysis of this stretch of the Aurelian Wall is that it is not in fact Aurelianic. That is to say, it follows the line of the Aurelian Wall of constructed in the 270s, but virtually all of the fabric here is Honorian in date. And this is another one of Ewan's fine visualizations developed with our colleague Francesca Carboni and Mariana Franco. But it gives a sense of how that Honorian stretch worked. Now, the fact that such an extensive section of the Aurelian Wall was fundamentally rebuilt in this area, this is surely reflecting the power, the significance of the watercourse here. Not that it's washing it away, but this is unstable ground. It's difficult ground to develop a monumental structure. It needs reworking. So this is an important part of thinking about how landscape and structures are interacting. Other themes that we have to keep in play, I think, when we think about how landscapes and structures are interacting are evidenced when we look further to the north. If we move into the area that is now occupied by the Villa Volkonski. And here work, again, another package of structural analysis coordinated brilliantly by Taya Ravasi. Here we see work on the tomb of Tiberius Claudius Vitalis. It's a fantastic structure, and visualization work gives us a little bit of a sense of its elevated height in its early form. Tiberius Claudius Vitalis, as the name suggests, a freedman of the Emperor Claudius. What the structure also gives us evidence of, and here I take this famous tomb as one example of a much wider phenomenon, is what happens over time, because we can see how the building is itself restructured as the ground surface rises to allow ongoing access to the tomb. And that is the kind of pattern that has got to be regarded as significant if we just want to think of Rome as a space that is being experienced by generations of people in different ways. That even such a matter as the ground rising a relatively short distance has implications for how you approach a building, how you access it, how you see it, how it appears, how visible it is. And of course this image brings together things that are going to be very important in framing the space of Rome. That other extraordinarily visible element, the Claudio-Neuronian aqueduct running through here. This is a part of Rome where the elevation that we see in our area has a particular resonance, because it's also an area where a lot of the water piped in through aqueducts is coming through. It's a very significant juncture. So heights are significant. They are there to be exploited. And even on this high point within our area, we can see significant changes in the ground surface over time. Similar thing happens not so very far away on the Via Statilia. Mid-1st century, you can look at the tombs, and again we can see the ground height shifting, the way people are approaching those tombs, the way they're tending those tombs, the way other things ultimately subsume those tombs, all part of the narrative of the physical transformation of the city. And I mentioned earlier on this issue about visibility. Those tombs, of course, were located where they were because they were on a point of access, a road running into the city. They were also on high ground, or in a desirable space. But as MacDonald notes in his classic study of architecture in the Roman world, visibility, to which he devotes an entire section, is a particular Roman concern. And to facilitate that is what he refers to as a prime occupation of Roman architects. That is terrace building. And terraces, and our understanding of terraces, is something, again, that takes us not just above ground, but also below ground as we try and understand urban transformation. And areas that have been terraced, of course, often end up, through their very prominence, targets for further development, enhancement, and elevation. So here I take us this time towards the Lateran and to a couple of locations. The first immediately south of the Aurelian Wall, and the second underneath the Lateran Basilica itself. Because in private gardens, just south of the Aurelian Wall, and in the shadows underneath the Lateran Basilica, we can find traces of the kinds of terracing structures that are designed to allow for transformation of a particularly prominent and visible part of the landscape. Here, what you can see through the power of laser scans taken underneath the Lateran Basilica are, in the first instance, the frescoed walls, frescoes of the Hadrianic period, of one of the magnificent houses of the Horti that actually occupied this side of the Caelian, the Lateran Hill. The strange box-like arrangement is because brick coffers, once these buildings have been destroyed purposefully for another stage of building, brick coffers have been installed to create a new terrace, and it's on that terrace that the Emperor Septimius Severus's Castronova, or new fort, a new home for his horse guard, is founded. And that terrace is to end up being reused. It's the significance of that space reused several times. So Ewan shared this image with us earlier on, a simplified visualization drawing on evidence from the extent of one of the extraordinarily lavish houses that occupied this space, quite probably, or quite possibly, I should say, already in imperial possession by this stage. And then the drama of the introduction of the Castronova into this landscape. And I'll talk more about this when I talk about the military transformation and its symbolism and its tactical significance later on. And that line, of course, then ends up having its own significance, its own consequences when we look at the planning of the Aurelian Wall in later years. Now, that's one way of looking at the city. It's a way of looking at the transformation of the city as one might encounter it from the southwest. And we'll go back to that viewpoint a little bit later. And we'll think about what that looks like in later periods too. But before we do that, let's take another look at the same area, looking out from the southeast. We see here an area with elite residences. Now, in all of these images, in all of these models, we're modeling what we can reasonably find hard evidence for. And one of the things that people will be aware of is there are several absences. Ewan has already mentioned we don't have enough trees in our landscape. It's not a green enough landscape, and Philoda's gone a long way to explaining why we are where we are with our visualizations based on actually the survival of proxy data. But we continue to work with that. But if one leaves aside the question of green spaces and the fact that there are going to be a multiplicity of other smaller structures that we're not understanding, there are key elements that are eye-catching, and their physical relationship to one another is telling us something quite important about the dynamics of what's going on, because this area, this residential area, ends up then with the superimposition of the Castra Nova, and this is part of one of the big transformations when we're talking about the military and security dynamic, one of the big transformations of Rome. And it's something that has very significant implications in the southeast of Rome, but is part, as scholars are increasingly recognizing, I think, and as a recent exhibition celebrated, of the scale of Septimius Severus's work across the city. But interestingly enough, it starts here. The Castra Nova is one of the first big monuments that Severus actually launches in Rome. Now, alongside a familiar military architecture that actually one can recognize from the provinces in this space, we also have evidence from its interiors that allows us, in this case, a full color visualization, a provocation that we can really support all details on with confidence, that reminds us that the interior of some of these military stations could be really quite elaborate, a reflection, I think, also of the way in which the Guard stood within Roman society. One level privileged and prosperous, at another threatening and potentially greatly feared. Now, alongside this area, we have, nonetheless, whatever Cassius Dio might have had to say about these terrifying military figures who are emerging, we have wealthy families continuing to live and prosper in the vicinity. Some of them certainly associated with the imperial circle. Work under the Ospedale di San Giovanni has allowed us, for example, to create this visualization, give a glimpse of one of the houses that endured well into late antiquity. And we see these houses, from the evidence we've got, variously adapting. The nearby Horti of Domitia Lucilla, mother of Marcus Aurelius, shows adaptation for production purposes, shows the restructuring of parts of the property to exploit passing commercial traffic. And shows a dynamism, but it also shows important continuities. And that issue of dynamism and continuities, the intersection of them, raises the question of how, as we model landscapes, as we try and visualize landscapes, we also want to animate transformation. Now, by that I don't just mean thinking about how things change over several centuries. I mean how we actually want to use the models that we generate to ask questions about how movement operates. How do we bring them alive? And there are different ways of doing this, and I'm not going to explore all of them here because my colleagues have a lot of excellent things to say about these to come over the next couple of days. But to take one example that we've already touched on and just push it that little bit further, the movement of water. When we start to take water, not just in terms of natural agency, as we were discussing earlier on, but also in terms of its canalization, its use, the way in which it actually provides lifeblood for an urban area. It's something that we can approach powerfully archaeologically, but it's also something that we find coming up, of course, as a key theme in terms of the literature of the city, the way in which the infrastructure of water is being used and abused, whether we're talking about it being cut, the aqueducts being cut during the Gothic Wars, as Procopius records, whether we're talking about the way in which the Liber Pontificalis very specifically signals out the improvement and enhancement of the hydraulic system to serve the baptistry in the 7th century. All of these points, right down then to the individual points of plumbing within individual structures, need to be brought together, and that's one of the reasons I most especially welcome the holistic view of hydraulic systems that Elettra Santucci has brought to this project. We also, though, can talk about different forms of movement beyond water. Movement of sound is something that Luca Foschi has been doing some pioneering work on, and I'm delighted that we're going to be hearing more about that in this conference. How does architecture actually reflect the sounds of the city? How is it designed to accommodate those sounds? What does the sound travel interior to some of these spaces mean, and how does it convey information over distance? We're talking about the movement of people, and as Susan Rands, who's working on one of the project PhDs here, focused on this near area of the baptistry, basilica and castro, would be keen to remind us, there's also an animal turn to be taken into consideration when we think about urbanism. This is an area of Rome where we know that there were a lot of animals. An area, for example, with 2 regiments of the Emperor's Horse Guard, and if we take one of the 2 readings for the origin of the name Asinaria, a still longer equine association. What does this mean about movement and the experience of being in this part of the city? We can also, though, think about the way in which these big monuments formed parts of backdrops to different ways of exhibiting power, influence, and ideology. And certainly it is, I hope, engaging to move away from the discussions, however important they are, of the Capitoline and the Forum, the foci of earlier processions, sacravia, of early processional rituals, and to think about how processional ritual is also going to be operating in this part of the city. And that works in various different ways, but we have an emerging backdrop, I think, to think through this. So we can consider, therefore, that at the one hand, at the far end here of our area, Hortis Veteres, we are in an area which has had a religious association since the 5th century. This is where there was a Republican temple, the 5th century BC, dedicated to Spes. 1 clear mile outside the centre of the city. It's a place where processions of which we know little and rituals of which we know little must have been conducted. But there are other processions, perhaps higher profile, certainly higher profile, but perhaps more exotic, that we do know a little bit about. It must surely have been to this location that Elagabalus came on his celebrated procession with a 6-horse chariot, carrying with it the sacred stone of Emesa around about the year 221, an exotic and, for Herodian, absolutely fascinating spectacle that most likely terminated in the area of the Caesarion. So the Caesarion emerges really with new investment, again in the time of Septimius Severus, end of the beginning, we should say, of the 3rd century, and is associated also with Elagabalus. And we can see here something of a pattern of extraordinary investment, including, for a brief while, the largest circus for chariot racing in Rome, bigger even than the Circus Maximus. Close study of the structure indicates that it was relatively short-lived, shorter lived even than we used to think. But this elaborate complex speaks both of being a focus for procession, something with a draw for audiences, who could and who couldn't access the Amphitheatrum Castrense. Access is certainly prohibited, constrained, controlled through the addition of a porticus triumphi here, this long, long passageway which you can see conjoining the amphitheatre and the circus. And when it is adapted in a later stage, we think that one of the structures that is introduced into this landscape, and this argument comes to us not only from the excellent work already done by our colleagues working at Santa Croce, but augmented by our own borehole survey and modelling work. We think it's here that we're seeing the temple of Elagabalus, at which this extraordinary procession of the 220s terminated. Now, this landscape undergoes multiple changes. The Aurelian Wall, of course, cuts rather unceremoniously through the old course of this great Varian circus. And it undergoes still further changes in the transformation of this building, which of course we know better now today as the Basilica of Santa Croce. A building that continued to enjoy a vibrant life through into the 6th century and of course well beyond through to today. Declared a titular church by Pope Gregory I in 523. It was restored again by Pope Gregory II in the early 8th century. Its association, of course, with the relics of the Holy Cross ensured that it was drawing people out. Pilgrims would come here. People would be drawn out from the centre of the city. It also ended up in an important relationship, of course, from the perspective of processions and intervisibility, with an older foundation and a more important one in many respects, what is now the Archbasilica of San Giovanni in Laterano. And in many ways, it is the remodelling of this space, to which I've already alluded, that is one of the single most important moments in terms of the transformation of the later history of this area. The physical transformation can be conveyed somewhat through this, what we call three-tier provocations, where we're actually bringing together multiple different perspectives. Now, all of these elements here are modelled, but they're geospatially correct. So one of the points that you might like to note from this is the fact that the basilica is built on a still higher level. Its ground surface is about 1.2 to 1.4 metres higher than the ground floor of the castra. Parts of the castra ground surface were built about over 5 metres above some of the surrounding buildings before them. So a steady elevation here. Now, with the creation of the world's first cathedral here, with the papacy having its palatial structures over time here, we also see, of course, another way of celebrating through procession, through ritual, the new centrality of what was formerly a peripheral area. The stational liturgy in Rome was introduced by Pope Hilarius in the 460s, and every day the Pope and clergy would move from the Lateran to one of 38 designated stational churches. It's a ritual that was to have profound implications for how people saw relationships between the buildings and spaces of Rome. But it wasn't just relationships of the building itself. It was also what was going on inside the building. This is one of those cases where visualization, I hope, and here, nice to have, I think, the authors of this visual all with us today. The reimagining what the Lateran Basilica itself looked like from a whole range of surviving data, from relocating spoliation within a digital provocation here, actually gives us a little bit of a sense of how liturgical space was working, and the ideas about what liturgical space should look like, how the liturgy should be celebrated, were actually, to prove, very significant, very, I believe, influential, well beyond the Lateran itself. And on top of that, I think we have another very important transformational structure to consider here. Our visualization shows on the right the Lateran Basilica, constructed or consecrated in the 320s, the world's first cathedral. But as this area ended up acquiring steadily more different aspects of the Christian church and its governance, so, of course, there was a steady growth in other types of space, other spaces for other officers of the church. And for the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, we see a steady development leading to the growth of an episcopal palace called the Episcopium during the second half of the 7th century, and the Patriarchium from the 7th century. And this space, the Patriarchium, is to be used by the popes until at least the 14th century, when the popes end up moving to Avignon, and the complex is damaged by fire. It's substantially destroyed under Pope Sixtus V, which means that visualizing it is a challenge. But there are a lot of clues, and we've been able to link those into the archaeological evidence from this area, the surviving archaeological evidence, to get a sense of the relationship of these structures. And I think one of the things that one's struck by here is the way that the developments, and they're pictured here in stylized form as they would have been in the reign of Pope Leo III, around about at the end of the 8th century. And one of the things that one's struck by is their monumentality. Another is the way in which they reshape the space around the basilica, and they reshape the question of access into the basilica. And that, I think, is an extremely important part, because it's also something that must have had a very significant visual potency for those who visited. And amongst those who visited, we are, of course, mindful of that great figure of Western history, that powerfully influential figure of Western history, Charlemagne. Charlemagne certainly was affected by his journeys to Rome, and the reference in his own foundation at Aachen to a connection with the Lateran that was played on at multiple levels, right down to the collection of bronzes he had, which echoed the bronzes in the Lateran's own collection, is an example of how powerful a space this was in terms of influencing ideas about rulership, about imperial power, and about the reach of Rome. Now, I mentioned earlier on that we would return to this view because I think it is worth reflecting further on Charlemagne's visit to Rome, or visits to Rome, and their impact on him and on his court. The Castra Nova has long since been demolished. It has been replaced by the world's first cathedral. Those visiting Rome from the southwest are approaching here through the Porta Asinaria. Ian Richmond famously worked hard on visualizing, and part of his seminal work on the walls of Rome, the Asinaria. His images are still routinely reproduced on information panels. And one of the things that Ian said was that the Aurelian Wall was in some ways a discrete monument. It seems an extraordinary thing to say, but he said the world was not to know that Rome required a wall. And I still find this a very strange comment from an individual who knew the wall as well as he did. But it is striking that through the process that we've taken to the data and the legacy data and to the recording of the data below ground and to the recording of the shifting ground surfaces, we could see that the Porta Asinaria was in fact much higher and more monumental than Richmond actually realized. Even so, we can see with its construction under Aurelius that the basilica would still have been a very visible element to anyone approaching. And this remains still, broadly speaking, true with the doubling of the size of the Aurelian Wall under the Emperor Honorius. Now, one of the things that I found very interesting to think with recently was reflecting on Del Lungo's work on the Einsiedeln itinerary. And of course, this is a document that is written about and by many scholars and from many perspectives. But it contains several fascinating features. And one of them is that it contains several different itineraries, starting from different gates in Rome, and telling individuals what they can see on the left or on the right as they progress on a certain route. And it's not necessarily always quite clear, well, what is the point of this document? One level, it is to show people the sights of Rome, but why are monuments grouped in the way they are? Because the tours do not necessarily actually group monuments by proximity. An implication being that we're seeing an introduction to some kind of viewpoints, points at which you don't necessarily have to visit or progress through structures, but you're looking at a visual language, if you like, of what you can see from certain angles, certain viewpoints. Why are those viewpoints selected? Well, the viewpoints are selected to allow, certainly churches, but also to allow observation of baths, columns, fora, aqueducts. In other words, a collection of monuments built up over the centuries from Rome which convey a certain message that talk about some of the seminal significant achievements of Rome and Roman civilization in this transformed city. And what is interesting here is De Lungo's opinion that the context for the creation of this document is perhaps linked to a series of visits of Charlemagne to Rome, starting in 774 and culminating with Charlemagne's coronation in 800. Now, whether we accept this argument or not, it is a very attractive way of understanding how visual encounters with cities can be potentially understood as a way of conveying messages that can then be internalized and taken still further afield. And for Charlemagne, a new Constantine, is very interesting, therefore, to reflect on what his encounter with Rome in 3 dimensions and in 4 dimensions, indeed, would have done. Now, over the next couple of days, what we're going to do is look at some of these ideas in rather more granular detail. We're going to explore individual sites, individual structures within the complex of Rome transformed, and think about how they work as part of a larger landscape. So tomorrow morning, for those who are able to join us, and for those who aren't able to join us, we will keep a recording of this so you can tune in later. There will be a session on political transformation, by which we're talking really about power, politics, and society. The military transformation, which looks both at the military and conventional form, but also the nature of security and the symbolism of the military, will kick off tomorrow afternoon at 14:30. And we will turn to religious and ritual transformation on Friday to follow with some discussions of economic transformation and a wider discussion of the story so far. As we progress, as this evening and in all other sessions, we very much appreciate your feedback, please. We are in the home stretch for Rome Transformed, but there is a lot of work to be done. Our publication series, which will come out through the British School at Rome over the next couple of years, lies ahead of us. So this is a great opportunity, please, to help us to refine the ideas that are going to find their ways into those pages. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you very much for taking us through over 800 years of history, winding our way across the Eastern Caelian in a quite spectacular form, and taking us through issues from water security for the aqueducts through to the change in landscapes, the military presence, the political presence. It's been quite transformative, and as has the project as well. We are open now for questions both here from the audience and also online as well. So please, there is a microphone going round as well, so please wait for the microphone as well to ask any questions in order that, that those people following online can also hear them as well. So please feel free to ask, to grill Ian on any of those matters. There is opportunity as well over the next couple of days as well if you want to follow up as well. But if you do have any questions, now is a good time. Also to other members of the team who Ian said as well.
Yes, absolutely.
At the back.
Ian, thank you very much. That was most stimulating. And I've got two words in response, which is horse manure. That's not a comment on your paper, but it's actually something you've just made me think about in terms of the relationship between the Severan Castronova and the productive suburbium. And it's inspired by a talk I heard Mike Bishop give some years ago on the Roman cavalry, where he insisted on the quantity of dung that horses produce, about 9 tons a year per horse. If you've got, 1,500 Severan horse guards, and each one has one horse, and we're not even thinking about remounts, then that works out, I calculate, as a total of about 37 tons of dung per day from that camp, which they need to deal with. So have you thought about that and how that might relate to the productive rural economy?
Thank you. I have actually. Yes, I mean, it's a great.
Splendid.
It is a great question, but it is an interesting one where I think we possibly have slightly more granular figures for the number of horses than we do people in the area, and Taya will be exploring questions of population size in further detail. Yes, very much so. How much? And I am going to be focusing in that in some detail tomorrow because it's part of the impact. But from how much they need to drink, to where that dung goes, to how it gets out of the place, all fascinating questions. And again, one of those things that I think helps us to animate this space, suddenly thinking about the the dynamic of just serving an equine population has so many implications. I think it also has other implications as well, because as Columella would remind us, some of these areas which are looking less suitable for building on are actually pretty good to have horses. So you've got an interesting juxtaposition between the equine necessities and also the problems of what you can and can't allow within the pomerium that perhaps help decide why we end up with the horse units there rather than elsewhere. But no, I think I think that obviously this approach to quantification gives us some excellent ideas to think with. I would probably end up with a slightly smaller horse guard on balance, and therefore a smaller number of horses, but it's a big consideration one way or the other, and horse manure certainly a very significant one. Yes, thank you.
That also feeds into the water, questions of water you were talking about as well. Presumably with that, along with the dung, there's also, I don't know what the quantities are, of water which needs going to be consumed as well. Which
yes, I promise to try tackling that one as well. Yes, and the so they are very big considerations, and it just I think helps us to look at Rome from a different angle through this animal turn, certainly.
Thank you so much. That was enlightening. I have a question about the relationship between the Circus Varianus and what looks like, or what we would be tempted to interpret as the Temple of Sol Invictus. I remember having read somewhere that during the time of Elagabalus, the starting gates of the circus were slightly pushed backwards, and therefore the overall length of the circus was reduced, and this has been linked to the purpose of providing space for the temple. So I was wondering if you've had the chance to verify this in the field, and also from what I remember about the readings I've done about the villa, about the circus. Sorry, what has been interpreted as the temple is some sort of rectangular feature found sometime in the 1950s when they were making the houses for the redware workers, and all is preserved in archive documents is a rectangle with no information on where it actually is, and no data on the configuration of that. So I wonder if you have if you got to know more, because I'm really curious about that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, as with the last question, when I should really, in a way, have handed over to one of my colleagues, Susan Rands, who's also particularly passionate about the horses question. Here, I should probably hand over to Gianluca on that very question. But I'm going to. I want to start with an anecdote that's related to that, because we have quite a lot more information that goes alongside those archival photographs, but there's still space for debate as to the exact nature of that structure. But one of the challenges that emerged from the visualization process was this question of how this big monumental block, whatever it is, and the gates actually worked. And when we looked at some of Ewan's modelling, I was thinking, how do you get a chariot into that space? And this led to a fascinating discussion with Gianluca, where we were looking at the presence and proximity of large monuments next to carceres in other cases, in other circuses, and the fact that actually chariots could be backed into starting gates, which I hadn't realised before. I didn't think chariots had a reverse gear. So I thought that was, it was one of those things where wrestling through the way that the three-dimensional spaces seem to emerge presented certain challenges. But rather than me monologuing, Gianluca, would you like to say something more about how we brought together the data?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, the problem that's a very problematic building. So our hypothesis is based on the dimensions of the structure. So it was hypothesized in the past that it was a tower, but it's just too big to be a tower. And from our boreholes, we see a structure that has like several meters of foundation, like 10 meters more foundations. We have some pictures of the excavation from the Skrinari archive that show a rectangular structure with a wall that seems offset. So, but from the picture, it is clear that the photograph was taken when the structure was not entirely excavated. So if we compare the pictures to the plans that we have from the archives, we see actually that we have a symmetrical structure with two other walls in the middle. And the shape that matches quite well with other temples that we have in terms of dimensions, proportions, and depth of foundations. The problem of the gate, so this structure from the geophysics seems to be approximately at 4-7 meters from the gate, so it's quite close. We have other examples, for example, in Jerash, where a whole sector of the starting gate is blocked by, so it's not used, and it's never been used. In Jerash, is very clear because we have a wall with a big gap on that side, so it cannot be used. We were also wondering about how the procession into the circus was working, so whether the chariots were entering from the central gate, going around for the procession, and then being led back to the gates. But yeah, this is what we are thinking about at the moment.
The borehole and geophysics have helped.
Yeah. And laser scanning as well, because we put all together. So.
Are there any further other questions from the audience or indeed online? No? Extremely clear, and I think you've been waiting to maybe hold a few more questions over the next few days. I think if there are no further questions, I will round up. But I would also take this opportunity as well to, along with Ian, thank all of the team who've worked on this. But I would also take the opportunity, as we can this evening, also to thank Ian. It's a lot of work, and he's done it masterfully to bring together one of these very long-term 5-year projects to bring together so many organizations and people spread across the world and spread across all the different time zones and everything. And I think it's been a masterful achievement in itself to bring this project to this stage and now into this wonderful conclusion. So I think as well as thanking Ian for this wonderful summary this evening and looking forward to the next few days, but also congratulations as well on so massively bringing this project together as well. So thank you very much.